Thank you, Mr. President. I want to speak about our immigration debate and my amendment in particular. But first, let me say, we're going to find out just how serious our colleagues are about granting not just legal status to the Dreamers, people who came to this country, were brought here illegally when they were children and shouldn't be held accountable for that action. But the proposal that will be available for a vote later this week will not just grant legal status, but will actually grant a path to citizenship. It goes well beyond the illegal executive order that President Obama issued, and it will be available to far more people than those who took up President Obama's illegal executive order. So it's really going to be an extraordinary moment. I hope we are able to reach an agreement on this, because I think this needs to get done. But I want to first address an amendment that I've offered and is now up and pending, and we'll be voting on it, I think, at some point this week, which is all about keeping our community safer by addressing the terrible problem of sanctuary cities. This is a problem that one father in particular knows all too well. See, on July 1st of 2015, Jim Steinley was walking arm in arm with his daughter Kate on a pier in San Francisco. And suddenly a gunman sprang out, opened fire, hitting Kate. She pleaded, "Help me, Dad," as she bled to death in her father's arms. Now, any murder is appalling. But one of the things that makes this even more appalling is that the shooter should never have been on the pier that day. The fact is, he was an illegal immigrant who had been convicted of 7 felonies and had been deported 5 times. But even more galling, Mr. President, is that 3 months before the day that he murdered Kate Steinley, this murderer was in the custody of the San Francisco Police Department. They had him. He was in custody. They had him on a warrant an old warrant for a previous crime. When the Department of Homeland Security found out that the San Francisco Police Department had this guy in custody, they immediately reached out and said, "Hold this guy until we can get someone there to take him into custody. We know he's dangerous. We know he's here illegally, and we want to get him out of this country." But the San Francisco police couldn't provide that minimal cooperation. Instead, they released this man back onto the streets, from which 3 months later he murdered young Kate Steinley. So why would the police of San Francisco do a thing like that? Why in the world would they refuse to provide this minimal cooperation with the immigration authorities with respect to a dangerous individual? Well, the reason, Mr. President, is because San Francisco is a sanctuary city. And what that means is it has as its explicit legal policy a prohibition that forbids their police from cooperating with federal immigration officials, even if the police want to. It extends to other law enforcement like sheriffs and deputy sheriffs. This is the case even when the local law enforcement authorities believe that the person is dangerous, and the local law enforcement folks wish to cooperate with the federal authorities because they know that this person is a threat to the security of their communities. But the local politicians override the police and decide that this will be a sanctuary city. Such is the case with San Francisco, and so the San Francisco police had no choice. They were required by the local laws to release this man onto the streets. You know, one of the many ironies about these sanctuary cities is if federal officials had called the San Francisco police about any number of other crimes, a robbery, car theft, violating a trademark, counterfeiting, any number of other federal crimes, then the San Francisco police would have been allowed to cooperate. They'd have been happy to cooperate. They would have been able to cooperate. But because the crime was committed by an illegal immigrant, the police hands were tied. The police were forced to release Kate Steinle's killer. Mr. President, it is just unbelievable to me that we have communities across the country that wish to provide this special privilege, this special protection for even dangerous criminals because they're here illegally. It's unbelievable. But that's the case. And sadly, the Steinleys are not alone, not the only family that's been affected this way, because, of course, San Francisco is not our nation's only sanctuary city. Philadelphia, the fifth largest city in America, the largest city in my home state, has an extreme sanctuary city policy, and it's had appalling consequences already. Maybe the most heartbreaking of these is a case of Ramon Aguirre Ochoa. Ochoa was a Honduran national in the U.S. illegally. He was deported in 2009, but he illegally re-entered the U.S., which is itself a felony, found his way to Philadelphia, and in 2015, the Philadelphia police arrested him on charges of aggravated assault and various other crimes. Well, when the background check went through, the Department of Homeland Security saw that the Philadelphia police had this guy, and they knew who this guy was. They knew he was here illegally. They knew he had been deported, and they believed him to be the dangerous criminal that he was. And so they asked the Philadelphia police, could you hold this guy for 24, 48 hours up until we can get an agent there to take him into custody and begin deportation proceedings? We know he's a bad guy. We want him out of the country. Unfortunately, Philadelphia police had to refuse. Instead, they released him onto the city streets in January 2015. The Philadelphia DA didn't feel like he had enough evidence to prosecute the case. He dropped the charges, and rather than cooperating with the Department of Homeland Security, they released Ochoa back onto the streets of Philadelphia. That was January of 2015. In July of 2016, Ochoa was arrested for raping a child under the age of 13. Mr. President, this brutal attack on the child was only possible because Philadelphia is a sanctuary city. And it's these appalling cases, like the Steinle case or this case in Philadelphia, that make it so important that we end these sanctuary cities if it's at all possible to do so. So my amendment is a bipartisan amendment. It is identical to a bill that I introduced and the Senate voted to consider in 2016. I reintroduced in 2017. And here's what it does. It does two things. It tackles a legal liability for localities that wish to cooperate with the Department of Homeland Security. And with that legal liability problem solved, it imposes penalties on communities that choose nevertheless to be sanctuary cities. We don't have the authority as a federal government to dictate the policy that a local community must follow. There's a constitutional separation that gives them the power to do what they will. But we don't have to subsidize their behavior when it endangers all of us. And that's what my legislation goes after. So let me discuss the first one, this legal liability issue. There are at least two court decisions now that have put pressure on municipalities, localities, to be sanctuary cities. Over a dozen Pennsylvania counties have done so. And one is a Third Circuit decision. The second is a federal district court in Oregon. And they have held that if the Department of Homeland Security makes a mistake and they make a detainer request, let's say it's a case of wrongful identity, they ask a community to a police force, a local police force, to hold someone who in fact is an American citizen, should be here, is here legally, and so it's therefore an erroneous detention. Well, if that happens and the local law enforcement folks comply with that request, under these court decisions, the local municipality can be held liable for the ensuing litigation on the part of the person who was wrongly detained. So my bill addresses this problem by simply saying that when a local law enforcement officer complies with an immigration detainer request from DHS that is duly issued and a bona fide request, then the local officer has the same authority as a DHS official. In a way, the officer would be considered an agent of the Department of Homeland Security for this purpose, and the entity that a person would then sue in the event that a person is wrongly detained and their civil rights are violated, the entity would be the federal government. The responsibility should be on the federal government, since it was, after all, a request that initiated with the federal government. My legislation does not in any way curb an individual's ability to file a suit if their civil rights, if their constitutional rights were violated, whether it's intentional or accidental. There is no curb on an individual's ability to redress that if they were wrongly detained. It simply transfers the liability from a municipality to the origination of the detainer request, which is the Department of Homeland Security. So that's the first part. Solve the legal liability problem that has some municipalities across America, and certainly in my state of Pennsylvania, has some of them choosing to be sanctuary cities even though they'd rather not be. Now, having addressed that, if our legislation is adopted and we have thereby solved this legal liability problem, if a community nevertheless decides that it's going to endanger all the rest of us by conferring this special protection on somebody just because they came here illegally, despite the fact that they may well be a dangerous criminal, why, in that case, then under my amendment, that community will be deemed a sanctuary city, and under my amendment, several types of federal funding would be withheld from it. Specifically, we would withhold from these sanctuary cities community development block grants and certain grants from the Economic Development Administration. And Mr. President, I think this is eminently reasonable. Sanctuary cities impose costs on all of us. It raises the costs for the federal government of enforcing immigration law. But by far outweighing that is the cost to the American people of more crime and the unbelievable, really staggering cost to families like Jim Steinle. It's his family. He and his family, who of course lost their daughter. I think it's extremely reasonable to have as a policy that if a community chooses to impose those costs on the rest of us, the federal government will not be subsidizing you. Now, Mr. President, let me debunk some of the misinformation that is occasionally disseminated about my legislation, my amendment. One is that it's somehow anti-immigrant. This is not anti-immigrant at all. This is pro-immigrant. The fact is, the vast overwhelming majority of immigrants to America, legal and illegal, would never commit these terrible crimes. There's no question about that. But it's also obviously the case that any very large number of people will include some criminals among them. Well, there's roughly 11 million people who are here illegally, 11 million illegal immigrants in the U.S. Some of them are certainly violent criminals. And it makes no sense to insulate those violent criminals, however few they may be, from capture by law enforcement. And it'd be absurd to allege that this is somehow anti-immigrant when quite likely some of their victims will be other immigrants. Immigrants want to live in safe communities too. I'm positive of that. They don't want dangerous criminals able to walk the streets just because they came here illegally. A second point I want to stress is this amendment does not discourage or punish illegal immigrants from coming forward to report a crime. This is important because folks who want to keep sanctuary cities sometimes charge that if my legislation were passed, victims and witnesses to crimes, if they're here illegally, they wouldn't come forward. Not so. What my amendment and this underlying law says, it explicitly states that a locality will not be labeled a sanctuary jurisdiction for this purpose, and therefore will not lose any federal funds if the policy of that municipality is that a person who comes forward as a victim or a witness to a crime local law enforcement does not share that information with DHS. So let me be clear and explicit about this. We've got an explicit carve-out in the legislation if a locality chooses to provide sanctuary status to a victim of a crime or a witness to a crime, that such a community would not lose any federal funds whatsoever. And we think that makes sense because we do want to encourage certainly victims and witnesses of crimes to come forward. So we get it. We don't want to create a worry that that would have deportation consequences for them. A third point that some have alleged, and I want to be very clear about, is the penalties my amendment has for a community that chooses to be a sanctuary city does not include the loss of any funds whatsoever related to law enforcement or security. That's simply not the case. The list of categories that we include in lost funding is economic development in its nature. It is not at all law enforcement. Another point that some on the other side have made is that somehow this legislation, my amendment, would impose an unmanageable burden on law enforcement. Well, one simple fact to consider is, if that's the case, then why has it been endorsed by national law enforcement groups? The National Association of Police Organizations has endorsed my amendment. The International Union of Police Associations, a division of the AFL-CIO, has endorsed my amendment. Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association have endorsed my amendment. Now, would these groups endorse a bill that imposed an unworkable burden on their own members? I rather doubt it. I think, actually, they understand that this amendment just encourages local law enforcement to share information with the Department of Homeland Security, and in some cases, to temporarily and briefly hold people in custody until the Department of Homeland Security can get there. So, Mr. President, this is a bipartisan amendment. In 2016, when the Senate voted on this very same amendment in the form of a freestanding bill, it received a majority, and it had bipartisan support. Unfortunately, a minority filibustered it and blocked it. But the fact is, it is a bipartisan piece of legislation with majority support. And so I don't think it should even be controversial. I think we will have a vote on this relatively soon in the coming days, and I hope it will have very broad support. This is just common sense. Mr. President, it stands for the principle that the safety of the American people matter, that the lives of Kate Steinle and other victims of violent crime matter, and that all of our communities should be as safe as they can be. Thank you, Mr. President.